All right. So, when you try and picture like the classic image of a hugely successful startup founder, who comes to mind? Like what's the image that pops into your head?
I think the sort of like the media that we consume kind of throws a lot of like young faces at us, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like you think of like the Bill Gates,
Yeah. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs,
Mark Zuckerberg, all those
all those.
kind of like prodigy.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And those are definitely the ones that tend to like break through.
Yeah, they make the headline
into the mainstream. And it's interesting because like when we were researching for this episode, and we were looking at this piece from Harvard Business Review.
Yeah.
It's interesting because even like they were pointing to this phenomenon. Like
Right.
they were saying that like the average age of founders who won TechCrunch awards,
Oh, wow.
which is, a pretty prominent award in the tech startup world,
Yeah, for sure.
was only 31. And then Inc. magazine's list of fastest growing startups from 2015.
Okay.
The average age there was even younger, 29.
So you really get the sense that like late 20s, early 30s, that's like the sweet spot to launch a company.
Absolutely.
Huh, interesting.
And then, it's not just media buzz either. Like even Paul Graham from Y Combinator,
Oh, yeah.
which is super influential,
Oh, for sure.
has said like investors get kind of wary of founders over 32.
That's so interesting.
So there's this idea that's been perpetuated out there that youth equals startup success.
Yeah, youth equals innovation and success and all of that.
But for this deep dive, we've got a piece of research that really throws a curveball at that whole notion.
Oh, really?
So the question we want to explore today is the image of the young founder, is that actually backed up by broader data?
Oh, that's a great question and a really important one because I think we often just kind of accept that narrative without questioning it.
Totally. Yeah.
So I'm very curious to see what this research says.
Yeah. So the research that we're going to dive into today is from the Harvard Business Review.
Yep.
And it's called Research. The average age of a successful startup founder is 45.
45. Wow. Okay, that's quite a bit older than what we were just talking about.
Right. Exactly. So
who are these researchers?
yeah, so it's by Pierre Azoulay, Benjamin F. Jones, J. Daniel Kim, and Javier Miranda.
Got it.
And what's interesting about their findings is that they really offer a different perspective on this whole.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued now to see like how they define success and, what kind of data they're looking at.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Awesome.
So listener, our mission today is to really unpack this research,
Yeah.
really understand, how they arrived at this average age of 45. And really try and figure out, what does this data tell us about the reality of entrepreneurial success?
Okay, great.
Which might be quite different from the common narrative.
I'm excited to get into it.
Me too.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading this was just the scale of this research.
Okay.
These academics didn't just look at like a few well-known companies or anything.
Right.
They analyzed a massive data set of startups
Interesting.
across a range of industries.
Okay, so it's not just focused on tech or any one particular sector.
Well,
That's great because that gives us a much broader picture.
exactly. And that allows us to look beyond those individual stories
Right.
and really try and identify broader trends that might be more representative.
The reality of the average startup.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's not just about, those few big names that we all hear about,
Okay, what you're saying, yeah.
but rather like,
The bigger picture.
yeah.
Okay.
So when you think about what successful means in this context,
yeah, how did they define success?
right? Because that's a really important question.
Yeah.
It seems like they took a pretty broad view.
Okay.
So they weren't just looking at companies that became like billion-dollar unicorns or anything.
Right, because those are the ones that get all the attention. But there's obviously so many other companies that are successful without reaching that kind of valuation.
Exactly. So they were looking at companies that had achieved significant growth and scale.
Okay, so they're really looking at impact and, sustainable businesses.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
So across this broad spectrum of companies
Mm-hmm.
that have achieved significant success,
Yeah.
the average age of the founder at the time of founding
Okay.
was 45.
45. Wow, that's a pretty big difference from the narrative that we usually hear.
Right.
So what do you think that tells us?
Well, I think it suggests that maybe experience the connections and the strategic thinking
Mm-hmm.
that often comes with having,
Years under your belt.
more years under your belt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Might actually be really critical factors
I see.
in building a business that not only survives,
Right.
but thrives.
So it's not just about having a great idea. It's about having the know-how to actually execute on that idea.
Exactly. Yeah, and having the experience to navigate all the complexities that come with running a business.
Yeah, and I'm thinking like someone in their mid-40s, they've probably seen a lot.
Right.
They've gone through different economic cycles. They've probably worked in different kinds of companies. Maybe they've even made some mistakes along the way that they've learned from.
Yeah.
So, that kind of experience is invaluable.
Absolutely. And I think it gives them a much richer understanding of the business landscape than someone who's just starting out.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's not just about coming up with that groundbreaking idea.
It's about having the operational know-how to make it a reality.
Exactly. And to scale it effectively.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think another thing that came to mind when I was reading this research was the networks that people build up.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
Over time. Right. So someone with, 15, 20 years of experience, they've probably built up a pretty significant network of contacts.
For sure.
Potential partners, customers, investors, employees.
Absolutely.
And those relationships can be so valuable.
Invaluable. Yeah.
When you're trying to launch and grow a new venture.
Yeah, because it's not just about you as the founder. It's about the team you can build, the people you can bring in.
Exactly. And the resources that you can access through those connections.
Right. And I think it also shifts our perspective on risk a little bit.
Oh, how so?
Well, we often think of younger people as being more risk-taking. But maybe it's not that founders in their 40s are less risk-averse.
Right.
Maybe they're just taking more calculated risks.
Yeah.
Because they have that experience to draw on.
I think that's a great point.
They can assess the potential downsides better.
Yeah. And they have a deeper understanding of,
the pitfalls.
Yeah, the potential pitfalls.
Exactly.
And it's not just about, business knowledge either. I mean, they might be in a more stable personal and financial situation, which can also be a huge buffer.
Oh, for sure.
During those initial uncertain phases of building a company.
Right.
So, it's important to remember that this research is highlighting an average, right? It doesn't mean that young people can't or don't build incredibly successful companies.
Of course not.
I mean, we were just talking about all those examples.
Exactly. And we don't want to discourage anyone from pursuing their entrepreneurial dreams, regardless of age.
Right.
But it is interesting to see that maybe the typical successful founder looks a bit different from what we usually imagine.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so compelling about this research.
Yeah, it challenges our assumptions.
Is that it really challenges our assumptions about who's actually out there.
And succeeding.
Building these successful companies.
Exactly.
And they even look specifically at the founders of the fastest growing new ventures. The ones that we often think of as like...
Yeah, the superstars.
Yeah.
The rock stars.
And guess what their average age was?
I'm going to guess 45.
45.
Yeah. Okay, so even when you look at the companies that are growing at an incredibly fast rate, it's still the same trend.
Still the same trend.
That's fascinating.
So that's a really striking statistic.
Yeah.
And it really challenges that dominant narrative.
It really does make you wonder if those skills that you hone over years of experience, like strategic planning, team leadership, financial management, navigating all those complexities, maybe those are even more critical for success than just having like a raw, innovative idea.
Right. It's about taking that idea and actually being able to execute on it.
Exactly. And make it go
in a sustainable way. So for you listening who might be in your 40s or even older and has been thinking about starting a business, but maybe you felt like
it's too late.
Yeah, like, I missed my window.
I missed the boat.
Yeah. This research offers a really compelling counter-argument.
Totally.
Like, actually, your years of experience might be your greatest asset.
It's not a disadvantage. It's an advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
Your experience, your network. All of that is incredibly valuable.
And it really challenges this idea that entrepreneurship is just a young person's game.
For sure.
And in fact, the data suggests that accumulated knowledge that you have and that professional network could actually significantly increase your chances of building something really successful.
And impactful.
Yeah. It's almost like those earlier career stages are really crucial for gaining that experience.
Right.
And building those connections.
Just laying the groundwork.
Exactly. And then later on, you're in a much stronger position to leverage all of that.
To launch something amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
And it makes you wonder, you know, with all this focus on young founders in the VC world, in the media,
right.
are we kind of missing out?
Overlooked?
Yeah, are we overlooking a really significant
and potentially very successful
demographic
right.
of entrepreneurs who are starting their ventures a little later in life?
That's such a good point, because I think there is this kind of unconscious bias towards youth in the startup world.
And maybe that bias is causing us to miss out on
a wealth of talent and expertise.
Exactly.
So it's definitely something to think about.
So to bring it all together for you, listener, while those stories of the young tech prodigies are super captivating.
Oh, they are, for sure.
And they definitely exist.
Yeah.
The data that we've explored today from this Harvard Business Review research paints a very different picture of what the average successful startup founder actually looks like.
So what's the key takeaway here?
Well, the key takeaway is that the average age of a successful startup founder, according to this research, is 45.
45, so not 29, not 31?
No, and that's a substantial difference from the image that we usually have.
It really is.
And it's worth emphasizing again that this average age of 45 was found when they looked at the founders behind the fastest growing new ventures.
Right.
The very companies that we often look to as like
the epitome of startup success.
Yeah, the gold standard. So while those young founders are out there and doing incredible things,
for sure,
this research really strongly suggests that the experience and the insights that often come with age might be an even more powerful predictor of building companies that not only launch, but are able to scale and thrive over the long term.
And not just thrive, but thrive in a sustainable way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, listener, this really gives you something to think about, right? Like, how does this information challenge...
A conventional wisdom.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom that you might have about entrepreneurship and the ideal age to start a successful venture.
Right.
Could it be that our cultural fascination with youth in the startup world has actually caused us to overlook
the advantages of experience?
Yeah, the considerable advantages that come with experience and the wealth of knowledge that more seasoned founders bring to the table.
Right, and I think that's a question worth pondering.
It really is.
Because it might shift our perspective on who we think of as the ideal entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
And who we support and invest in.
And maybe even who we see as role models in the business world.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's definitely a perspective worth considering further.
Absolutely. I think this research has given us a lot to think about.
Me too.
And hopefully it's challenged some of those assumptions that we all have about age and entrepreneurship.
I think so. And hopefully it's inspiring for those out there who maybe thought that they'd missed their chance to launch something great.
Never too late.
Never too late.
That's what we've learned today.
Yeah, that's the takeaway.